You're listening to the Inside the Mix podcast with your host, Marc Matthews.
Hello, folks, and welcome to the Inside the Mix podcast. If you are a new listener, a big welcome. Make sure you hit that follow button on your podcast player of choice. And if you're watching this on YouTube, make sure you hit subscribe and that notification bell so you get notified when a new episode drops. So busy times here at Casa Inside the Mix / synth music mastering. My fiance and I, we've actually just started looking for a new house. So we're going to up sticks and move from where we are. Still in the same area in Devon, but we're actually looking at moving. So that whole process has started. And if you're listening to this and you live in the UK, you know how long this process takes once you get solicitors and everything else involved. It's a long process. A bit of a ball ache, to be honest, but it would be worth it in the end so I can get a bigger studio space. I say a bigger studio space like I need it. To be honest, where I have now is more than ample, but I want to take the studio. So at the moment, I'm paying rent for a studio premises, right? But I want to take it back in-house, so I'm not paying somebody else's mortgage or somebody else's sort of lease fee, if you will. So yeah, exciting times for that. And also, it will mean that I'll have more space so I can get this bloody reel-to-reel going as well. I've had it for ages. It's been sat in a corner just gathering dust. And I want to get it up and running so I can actually have some real tape emulation happening, folks. So at the same time as all that happening, my limited series podcast, I'm halfway through the creation process of it. So I've done drums and I've done bass and I've started on vocals. So after that, it's going to be synth and then effects. So it's going to be an entirely free limited series podcast, and you'll be able to get it on all podcast platforms, and you'll be able to watch the accompanying videos on my website as well. So you can head over to synthmusicmastering.com and watch all that. And I say it's going to be all free. I'm going to shove the project folder, and also that's the completed one, and also you'll be able to start from fresh, the stems, and what else is going to be there? The template as well, the mixing template. So you'll be able to get all of that for free. And I had wanted to get it out by the end of June, but I think I'm going to have to push it back slightly. But keep an eye out for that one, and I'll be releasing more bits and pieces as the weeks go on with regards to release dates and whatnot. So exciting times for that too. So the final bit of news is this, and I said I was going to give it a shout out to this individual, and an album was released a couple of weeks ago. So at the time this goes live, it would be a couple of weeks, maybe 3 weeks. And it's by a friend of mine called Bending Grid, who I've been chatting to for ages now. And I know he's been working really hard on this album, and we've been back and forth and whatnot. Anyway, I digress. So he's released this album called Parallax, and it is an absolute belter of an album. I can't get enough of it. It's probably my favorite release of 2024. And there's one song in particular on there called Vampires, which is an absolute banger. So folks, I implore you, I encourage you to go search for Bending Grid on Spotify, and you will not be disappointed by the Parallax album. It is an absolute belter of an album, easily my favorite of 2024. So let's dive into this episode. It's a tutorial episode, and it follows up episode 145, where we were looking at the enveloper, and we were manipulating the transients of a drum, a snare drum. And in this, what we did was, or rather that episode, we boosted the attack portion, the attack transient, okay, so we can add some more punch to a snare. So now we're going to look at the other side of the enveloper, and that is the release side. So in episode 145, we looked at the attack. This time, we're going to be looking at the release and what we can do with that. And in particular, what we can do with a drum loop, and a drum loop that is, for want of a better way of putting it, drenched in reverb. So we're going to attenuate that reverb using the release portion of the enveloper. So let's dive in. So here we are in Logic Pro, and I've got the enveloper or enveloper, however you want to pronounce it, open here. And I've got this drum loop, and I'm going to play this drum loop without the enveloper on, so it's bypassed. So here we go. So hopefully you can hear that. There's a lot of reverb on the toms, on the snare, and some other percussion in there as well. And we're going to use the enveloper now to attenuate and reduce that reverb. So let's enable the enveloper. And I've got the default settings here at the moment. And the first parameter we need to look at is the threshold. So if you've watched episode 145, you'll be familiar with it. But basically, just set it at -100 dB. And that way, any signal that exceeds that threshold is going to have its attack and release portion of that signal, that envelope, is going to be manipulated by the enveloper here. So just set it at -100. Obviously, you can change it, but for the default, in this instance, for what we're doing, we'll just leave it at -100. And the look ahead as well, it's at 1 millisecond. You can probably drag that down to 0. I don't particularly need it in this because there's not a lot of intricate transient stuff going on that I need the look ahead for. So the next parameter we're going to look at is the gain slider on this enveloper for this release section. And if we boost the gain, it's going to accentuate the release phase of the signal. And if we reduce the gain, it's going to attenuate the release phase of the signal. And thus, it will become drier. And you'll see what I mean. We're going to remove that reverb. We're going to attenuate that release phase of this drum loop, and it will start to sound drier. So I'm going to drag it all the way down gradually, and you'll see what I mean. So I dragged it all the way down to -100%, and it was too much. It's too much, right? What I'm going to do is I'm going to drag it back up and find a happy medium between it sounding dry, but I also still want to hear, I want to hear more of that release phase of this signal. Otherwise, it just sounds too cut off, right? So I'm going to drag it back up. We're probably looking at about -50 to -60%. So let's give it a go. So I settled on -60%. So we can still hear some of that reverb. Certainly not as much as before, but I'm hearing more of the release phase as well. So the release time is the time it takes for the signal at maximum gain to fall to the threshold level, basically, which in this instance is -100 dB. And I'm going to gradually increase it just to tighten up that reverb tail, but I still want that release phase of the signal. So it's at 200 milliseconds at the moment, and I'm going to gradually increase it until it just tightens up that reverb tail. So I've got it set there, 660 milliseconds. I'm happy with that at the moment because I can imagine if I were to put this loop in a whole mix, there's still a tiny bit of reverb there, but it's certainly less than what was before, and it would get lost in the mix, basically, lost in the shuffle, let's say. So let's A/B it. So I'll disable the enveloper. I'm going to play it without, and this is what it sounds like. So those toms, you can really hear the reverb. So listen out for the toms. So dung, dung, and now I'm going to turn the enveloper on. So listen out for the toms again. You can really hear that reverb tail is gone. Yeah, it's really attenuated that. So Logic's unsung hero, the enveloper. We can use the attack to boost the attack phase of a signal to add a bit of thwack, some punch. And we can use the release phase or the release side of this enveloper, manipulate the release phase to then remove reverb from a drum loop. Give it a go, folks. The unsung hero, the often overlooked enveloper in Logic Pro. And before you go, folks, if you haven't done so already, check out episode 145, where we look at the left-hand side of the enveloper and how we can manipulate the attack phase of a signal to add a bit of punch and thwack, as I just mentioned. So go check out episode 145 if you haven't done so already.